Welcome to H2 Black Thread. In today's powerful story, we meet Leela Johnson, a quiet black girl often overlooked by those around her. When her teacher mocks her intelligence, expecting her to fail, Leela surprises everyone by effortlessly solving a complex math equation, revealing a hidden genius. This moment sparks a life-changing opportunity, challenging Leela to break free from the limitations placed upon her by others. Stay tuned as we dive into a journey of resilience, self-discovery, and proving that no one should ever be underestimated. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow H2 Black Thread for more of our latest videos. The classroom was filled with the familiar hum of idle chatter, the soft rustling of notebooks, and the scratch of pencils against paper. It was just another typical day in Mr. Thomas's algebra class at Westbrook High. The bell had rung just a few minutes ago, and most of the students were settling in, trying to avoid the inevitable math lecture that was about to begin. Some were doodling on their notebooks, others staring out the window, lost in their own thoughts. At the back of the room, Leela Johnson sat quietly at her desk, her posture straight but relaxed, her head slightly tilted as her eyes scanned the notes in front of her. Leela wasn't a troublemaker, nor was she particularly outgoing. She was simply quiet, and that was fine with her. She had long since learned to keep her head down, avoid attention, and blend in. To everyone around her, she was invisible, but in a way that suited her just fine. She had her books, her thoughts, and her math. Numbers, for Leela, had always been a safe space. Unlike people, they didn't judge, and they didn't make assumptions. She could feel Mr. Thomas's gaze drift across the room, and she could feel the weight of it when it lingered on her. Mr. Thomas was the kind of teacher who liked to be in control, who liked to make students feel like they were nothing more than numbers in his classroom. He would mock those who struggled, belittle those who failed, and praise only those who were the best at what he deemed important. Leela had learned early on that Mr. Thomas wasn't interested in anyone's true potential, only in how well they conformed to his rigid expectations. As the lesson began, Mr. Thomas, with his usual smirk, turned to the blackboard and started writing out complex equations, explaining them in a tone that made it clear he thought most of the students wouldn't understand. His voice carried an edge, one that made it clear he thought this was all just a bit too easy for him. But for Leela, the equations on the board were like a challenge, a puzzle she was eager to solve, but she knew better than to speak up. "All right, class," Mr. Thomas said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Let's see who can keep up with me today. We'll start with something a bit more advanced." He glanced over his shoulder and caught Leela's eyes for a brief moment, and then, as though he'd been waiting for the right moment to strike, he grinned. "Leela," he said loudly, breaking the silence in the room, "since you seem so uninterested in class today, why don't you come up here and solve this one for us?" His voice was sharp, mocking as he stepped aside, revealing a complex equation filled with fractions, exponents, and variables. Leela's heart skipped a beat. She didn't want to do this. She knew this wasn't a genuine invitation. It was a trap. Mr. Thomas wanted to embarrass her, wanted to prove that she couldn't solve the problem, and everyone would laugh at her. It was always the same with him. His eyes would gleam with delight every time he thought he could trip someone up. Leela hesitated, looking down at her notebook. Her hands clenched tightly around her pencil. She wasn't uninterested in class, she was just used to being ignored. She had learned early on that speaking up, especially in math, often meant putting a target on her back. But this time, Mr. Thomas had cornered her. "Come on, Leela," he taunted, his voice dripping with amusement. "Don't be shy, or are numbers too difficult for you?" A few students in the class snickered, and Leela could feel their eyes on her, each one like a pinprick against her skin. She could hear their whispers, some of them laughing under their breath, others exchanging knowing looks. "Oh, this is going to be good," one of the boys muttered, his voice barely audible but loud enough for her to catch. Leela took a deep breath and pushed her chair back. She had no choice. If she didn't go up to the board, Mr. Thomas would only make things worse. She stood, her legs shaking slightly, and walked to the front of the classroom. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of the room's eyes was pressing down on her shoulders. As she stood in front of the chalkboard, Leela glanced at the equation. It was a mess. Fractions mixed with exponents, variables spread haphazardly across the equation like an impossible maze. For most students, it would have been daunting. But for Leela, it was a challenge, a puzzle that could be solved if only she had the chance. She picked up the chalk, her fingers wrapping around it tightly. The room was silent now, save for the sound of chalk scratching against the board. Leela began to work through the equation methodically, breaking it down step by step. As her chalk moved across the board, she could hear the soft whispers behind her. At first, they were snickers, followed by hushed comments. Some of the students thought she was fumbling through the problem, while others seemed to think she would fail miserably. But Leela wasn't distracted. She had always been good at math. Numbers made sense to her in a way that people didn't. She just had never been given the chance to prove it. Mr. Thomas stood with his arms crossed, watching her intently, a smirk playing at the corners of his lips. "We don't have all day, Leela," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Come on, I'm waiting." Leela didn't respond. She couldn't let him break her focus. She continued to solve the equation, working with calm precision. She felt the weight of everyone's eyes, but she pushed it aside. She knew she could do this. This wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about proving herself, even if it was just to herself. By the time Leela reached the final step of the equation, the room was silent. No one was laughing anymore. No one was whispering. All eyes were on her, and she could feel their disbelief. She carefully wrote down the final answer, her chalk gliding across the board with confidence. She placed the chalk down and turned to face the class. The room was still. Mr. Thomas's smirk faltered for a brief moment. He walked closer to the board, his eyes scanning the equation. There had to be a mistake, he thought. There was no way someone like Leela, quiet, reserved, and unnoticed, could have solved this. But there was no mistake. The numbers didn't lie. A nervous chuckle escaped from Mr. Thomas's lips. "Well, lucky guess," he muttered, trying to dismiss her achievement. "Let's try another one." Leela crossed her arms over her chest and met his gaze. "There's no luck in math, Mr. Thomas," she said, her voice steady. "It's either right or wrong. And this," she gestured to the equation, "is right." The class erupted. Some students gasped. Others laughed in disbelief. But all of them were locked onto Leela in a way they hadn't been before. They had underestimated her, and now they couldn't look away. The room was thick with an awkward silence, the tension hanging in the air like an electric charge. The moment Leela turned around and placed the chalk down after solving the complex equation, the classroom seemed to freeze. For a brief moment, everyone stared at her as if she were a creature from another world, defying their expectations. Even Mr. Thomas, who had been so confident just moments ago, stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape. The students' whispers and gasps echoed in Leela's ears, but she didn't let them distract her. She held her head high, her eyes calm, though her heart was still pounding. She knew what this was. Mr. Thomas hadn't expected her to solve the problem. In fact, he had hoped she would fail so he could prove a point to the rest of the class. But instead, Leela had defied his assumptions. She had shown him, not just him, but the entire class, that she was more than what they expected. More than what they had judged her to be. Despite the astonishment in the room, Leela's mind was already moving forward, focusing on the next challenge, the next puzzle. That's how math worked for her. Always about solving the next problem, always pushing forward. But this wasn't just about solving a problem. It was about something bigger. It was about proving herself. Her eyes drifted to Mr. Thomas, who was still staring at the board, his eyes scanning the equation she had just solved. He was looking for a mistake, searching for any flaw in her work. The color had drained from his face, and his confidence had evaporated. Leela felt a surge of quiet satisfaction, but she knew she couldn't let it show. She had done the work, and that was enough for her. After a long, uncomfortable silence, Mr. Thomas cleared his throat. "Well, I guess. Well, I guess you got it right," he muttered, his voice lacking the usual sharpness. "But we'll see if you can do it again. Let's try something else." Leela said nothing, though she could feel the eyes of the class on her. She glanced toward Emma Rodriguez, a classmate who had been quietly watching from her seat. Emma smiled at Leela, a look of genuine admiration in her eyes, but Leela quickly turned her attention back to Mr. Thomas. The moment was over now, but the aftermath was still unfolding. "You," Mr. Thomas said, snapping his fingers toward Leela, "come up here again." Leela hesitated for a moment, but then she stood up. There was no escaping this. She knew that Mr. Thomas wasn't done with her. He wouldn't let it go. And perhaps, in a way, he was testing her, not just her ability to solve problems, but her patience. He wanted to see if she would crack under pressure, if she would give in to his authority. She walked to the front of the room again, feeling the weight of everyone's gaze on her back. Each step felt like a heavy thud on the floor, but she didn't falter. Leela had learned long ago that the most important thing in life wasn't proving yourself to others, it was proving it to yourself. And in that moment, she knew she had already done that. At the board, she stood tall, glancing at Mr. Thomas. He was already scribbling a new problem, one that was even more complicated than the last. It was a mixture of algebraic expressions, exponents, and fractions, all jumbled together in a way that would likely confuse anyone who didn't have the patience to work through it. Mr. Thomas turned to face the class. "Now, let's see if Leela can solve this one," he said, his tone slightly mocking, though the sharpness had dulled. "It's more complicated, so let's see how she does." Leela didn't react to his words. She simply looked at the problem. She could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her, the room so silent that she could hear her own breath. She took a deep breath and grabbed the chalk. Her fingers wrapped around it with a firm grip, steadying herself. She could do this. She knew what Mr. Thomas was doing. He wasn't trying to teach. He wasn't trying to help her. He was trying to make her fail again. He was trying to prove that she wasn't capable of solving these kinds of problems, and that even if she had solved the first one, it was just a fluke. But Leela wasn't going to let him get to her. Not this time. She began writing, the chalk scraping against the board in slow, measured strokes. The complex equation in front of her seemed insurmountable at first glance, but that's where the challenge lay, not in the difficulty of the problem, but in the patience required to break it down step by step. For the next few minutes, the room remained completely still. No whispers, no giggles, just the sound of chalk against the board as Leela worked. She broke the equation down carefully, keeping track of each step as she went. First, she tackled the exponents, then moved on to the fractions, simplifying them one by one. She worked with precision, unfazed by the lingering gaze of her classmates. The more she worked, the more the whispers started to die down. They had expected her to fail, but she wasn't. She was succeeding quietly, confidently. It wasn't a fluke. It wasn't a mistake. Leela Johnson was doing this, and there was nothing anyone could say to make her doubt herself. As the chalk slowly traced the final steps, Leela's mind raced through the numbers, the variables, the fractions, all of them clicking together as if they were always meant to be that way. She finished the problem and turned to face the class, her hand still gripping the chalk. The room was silent once again. No one spoke. Leela glanced at Mr. Thomas, who stood frozen, his eyes wide, his expression hard to read. He walked up to the board, his face showing no sign of recognition. He looked at the solution, back to Leela, then to the problem again. There were no mistakes. He could find no flaw in her work. His pride had been wounded, and now, in front of his students, there was nothing left for him to do but admit that he had been wrong. But Mr. Thomas, still reluctant to accept what was happening, simply cleared his throat and turned to the class. I guess that's correct," he muttered, his voice strained. "But let's see if you can keep up, Leela. You're not out of the woods yet." Leela didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her patience had been tested and she had passed. She had done what was required of her, solved the problems, stayed calm under pressure, and refused to let Mr. Thomas break her down. As she walked back to her seat, she could feel the eyes of the class still on her, and this time the whispers were different. They weren't mocking her anymore. They weren't laughing. They were questioning, wondering how someone like her, someone so quiet, so overlooked, had been able to do what none of them could. And for the first time in a long while, Leela smiled. It wasn't a triumphant grin. It wasn't a cocky smile. It was a quiet, satisfied smile. She had passed the test, not just of math, but of patience. And in that moment, she knew she had proven more than just her intelligence. She had proven that she was strong enough to handle anything that came her way. The classroom was buzzing with an energy that could almost be described as electric. The chalkboard, once a blank canvas, was now filled with a sprawling equation, complex, and filled with all the elements that usually sent students into a frenzy: fractions, exponents, and variables tangled together in an intricate web. But the person standing at the front of the room, holding the chalk with a steady hand, was not intimidated. It was Leela Johnson, the quiet, unassuming girl who had been mocked only moments earlier by Mr. Thomas, her teacher. Leela had solved the previous equation with an ease that was almost effortless. The first one had been hard, but not for her, not in the way it had been for her classmates. For Leela, numbers and equations weren't just abstract concepts. They were puzzles, and she had always been good at solving them. The problem was that no one knew this about her. They had never bothered to ask. She had been overlooked for most of her school life, ignored and underestimated. And yet, there she stood, poised and focused, making what had seemed impossible look almost simple. The silence in the room was thick. Every eye in the class was trained on Leela, watching her move with a calmness that seemed to be at odds with the tension in the air. It wasn't just the students who were watching her now. Even Mr. Thomas, who had been so eager to prove her failure, was standing there, his arms crossed, eyes narrowed as he observed her every move. His earlier smirk had long faded, replaced by a look of disbelief and discomfort. Leela didn't care. She didn't care about the looks, the whispers, or the silent judgment. The only thing that mattered in that moment was the equation before her. As she worked through the problem, breaking it down step by step, she could feel the weight of the room's expectations shift. At first, they had expected her to fail. No one could solve something like this, especially not her. But as the minutes ticked by and Leela's chalk flowed confidently across the board, the disbelief started to set in. It wasn't just the students anymore. It was Mr. Thomas, too. He stood at the edge of the room, watching her work, unable to shake off the nagging feeling that something was wrong. He had set Leela up to fail, convinced that she wouldn't be able to handle this level of complexity. But as she continued, solving the problem with precision, a creeping realization started to settle in his gut. This wasn't some lucky guess. Leela was solving the equation, and she was doing it flawlessly. He took a few steps forward, his face tightening. It had been a moment of quiet arrogance when he'd first asked her to solve this equation. His plan had been simple: make Leela look foolish in front of the class, remind her and everyone else of her place. But now, as he watched her break down the equation with a calm confidence, he couldn't help but wonder if he had miscalculated. When Leela finally placed the chalk down and turned to face the class, there was a long moment of stillness. The room felt almost frozen in time. No one moved, no one spoke. Mr. Thomas stood there, his mouth slightly agape, looking at the board where Leela had written the final solution. She had done it. She had solved the problem, and there was no mistake. There were no errors, no hesitations, just a flawless execution that left everyone in stunned silence. For a moment, Mr. Thomas couldn't speak. The words seemed to be stuck in his throat, his mind racing to make sense of what he was seeing. He had expected her to stumble, to fail, to make a mistake. But this was not what he had anticipated. The equation was perfect. Leela had solved it, and it was right. His mind churned with disbelief, trying to find some way to explain it, to justify why this was happening. Then, in an almost defeated tone, he muttered, "Well, I guess you got it right." He cleared his throat, trying to regain some semblance of control. "But let's see if you can do it again." His voice was tinged with frustration. There was no way Leela could have gotten it right. She was just a quiet student, the one who never spoke up in class. She couldn't possibly be the kind of student who could solve such a complex equation. But there it was in front of him, undeniable. Before Leela could respond, a voice cut through the tension. It was deep and calm, carrying the authority of someone used to being heard. Actually, she solved it perfectly. The class turned as one, surprised by the unexpected interruption. The door to the classroom had opened quietly, and standing in the doorway was a man in a sharp gray suit. His presence was commanding, his posture tall and poised. Professor Stevens. The students, most of them unfamiliar with the name, glanced at one another in confusion. But Leela, having spent years of her life learning to observe quietly, recognized him instantly. Professor Stevens was a recruiter for the National Mathematics Scholars Program, a program that sought out exceptional students who had the potential to excel in mathematics, but had not yet been discovered. Leela had heard about the program in passing, but she never imagined she would be a candidate for something like that. Mr. Thomas turned pale as he recognized the professor. "Professor Stevens," he stammered, his words failing him as he tried to regain some semblance of authority. I didn't realize you'd arrived." Professor Stevens stepped into the room, his gaze immediately landing on Leela. He studied her for a brief moment, as if assessing something much deeper than the equation on the board. His eyes were sharp, observant, and calculating. He walked up to the board and scanned the problem Leela had solved, his fingers lightly touching the chalk marks. "You've solved this problem without hesitation," he said, his voice measured but full of respect. "Tell me, young lady, do you often solve equations like these?" Leela hesitated for a moment, her heart racing. She had never been asked such a question before. She had always kept her math abilities to herself, never letting anyone know how easily the problems came to her. But now, with the professor standing in front of her, she could feel a shift. This wasn't just about solving a problem anymore. This was about something bigger. I just like numbers," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions in her chest. "They make sense to me." Professor Stevens nodded thoughtfully as though everything suddenly clicked into place. "I see," he said, turning to Mr. Thomas, who was still frozen, his eyes wide with confusion. "And you thought she couldn't do it?" Professor Stevens asked, his tone both gentle and firm. Mr. Thomas, now cornered, opened his mouth, but no words came out. He had no defense. The truth was right there in front of him, and it was undeniable. Leela had done what he had never expected. She had proven him wrong in the most spectacular way. "How would you like to take a real test?" Professor Stevens asked Leela, his eyes focused intently on her. "A test that could change your life." Leela's breath caught in her throat. A real test. What did that mean? Her mind raced, but she didn't speak. She wasn't sure what was happening, but the world seemed to have shifted in the span of just a few minutes. Professor Stevens placed a business card on the desk in front of her. "Take this," he said. "This is my contact information. I want you to take a placement exam next week. If you pass, you'll be eligible for a scholarship to one of the top universities in the country." The room erupted into whispers, gasps of disbelief filling the air. The students were shocked, their eyes wide as they tried to process what had just happened. Mr. Thomas, still reeling from the shock, stood there in stunned silence. Leela picked up the card, her hands shaking. She had never dreamed of such an opportunity, never thought that something like this could happen to her. But here it was, an invitation that could change everything. Leela glanced at Mr. Thomas one last time, her expression calm. "I'll do it," she said, her voice steady and strong. "I'll take the test." The room fell into a hushed silence, everyone now watching her with newfound respect. Professor Stevens smiled at her, proud of her determination. "Good choice," he said. And with that, Leela Johnson, the quiet, overlooked student, had taken the first step into a world that would forever change her life. The rest of the class passed in a haze for Leela. The tension from the earlier moments still lingered in the air, but now the energy was different. It wasn't the mocking buzz of judgmental whispers. It was the hum of curiosity, the crackling spark of intrigue. Leela could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her, but it wasn't the familiar weight of ridicule. This time, it was something else. It was respect, or at least, something approaching it. She sat at her desk, absently twirling her pencil between her fingers, her mind far away. She wasn't thinking about the classmates who had snickered at her earlier or the teacher who had tried to humiliate her. Instead, she was focused on one thing, the card in her pocket. The moment Professor Stevens had handed her that sleek, business card-sized piece of paper, the world around her had shifted. It wasn't just the shock of receiving such an opportunity. It was the realization that her life, her future, had just taken a sudden turn. The words National Mathematics Scholars Program and scholarship on the card seemed to glow against the drab lighting of the classroom. She hadn't even had time to absorb it fully before the bell rang, signaling the end of class. The students had packed up quickly, muttering amongst themselves about what had just transpired. Some were still in disbelief. Others exchanged looks, trying to make sense of the extraordinary event that had unfolded before their eyes. Leela, however, remained quiet, lost in her own thoughts. Her heart was still racing from the adrenaline of standing in front of the class and proving everyone wrong. "Miss Johnson," a voice called, snapping her back to reality. Leela looked up to see Mr. Thomas standing in front of her desk. He was trying to mask his discomfort with a neutral expression, but she could see the tightness in his jaw. He hadn't said anything to her since the moment Professor Stevens had walked into the room, and she had a feeling he wasn't thrilled about what had just happened. "Yes, Mr. Thomas," Leela asked softly, her voice steady. I wanted to talk to you," he said, his voice lacking the usual arrogance. "About what happened earlier." He paused, his gaze flickering to the door as if unsure of how to proceed. You solved that equation, and I wasn't expecting that. I'm impressed." Leela raised an eyebrow. She had expected some form of praise, but this was different. Mr. Thomas wasn't exactly admitting to any wrongdoing, but his tone had shifted. It was hard for him to swallow the fact that he had been wrong about her. "I didn't expect you to do it," he continued, clearly uncomfortable. "But that doesn't mean I think you're ready for something like this." He motioned to the card in Leela's pocket, where it was still tucked away, hidden from view. Leela bit her lip, resisting the urge to say something sharp. She had already proven herself, hadn't she? She had solved the problem in front of the whole class, without breaking a sweat, no less. She had done exactly what he had asked of her, and then some. She didn't owe him any more explanations. Before she could respond, the door to the classroom opened, and Professor Stevens stepped inside. He smiled at Leela and then turned his attention to Mr. Thomas. "Is everything all right here?" Professor Stevens asked, his voice smooth and calm. Mr. Thomas straightened up, obviously caught off guard by the sudden presence of the professor. Yes, just a conversation, he said quickly, clearing his throat. I was just explaining to Miss Johnson that we, weren't sure if she would be able to handle something like this. Professor Stevens raised an eyebrow. Handle it, he repeated. Miss Johnson has proven more than capable. I think it's clear now that she has far more potential than anyone could have imagined. Mr. Thomas stiffened, but didn't say anything. There was nothing he could say, not now. Professor Stevens turned back to Leela, his expression softening. Leela, he began, his voice warmer now, I wanted to speak with you privately about the next steps. I know this has all been a lot to take in, but I think you're ready for what comes next. Leela blinked, her mind reeling. Next steps, she echoed. What? What do you mean? Professor Stevens smiled, his eyes twinkling with something akin to excitement. The scholarship exam. It's part of the National Mathematics Scholars Program. The test will be rigorous, but it's a chance for you to prove just how much you're capable of. If you pass, we'll offer you a spot in the program and a full scholarship to a top university. Leela's breath caught in her throat. A scholarship. A spot in the program. She had heard of such things, kids who were naturally brilliant who got into prestigious universities on full scholarships. But she had never imagined that she could be one of those kids. She had always been overlooked, always kept her head down, trying not to draw attention to herself. But now, the opportunity to change everything was right in front of her. I don't know if I can do this, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The fear crept in, just for a moment. What if she wasn't as good as they thought she was? What if she couldn't live up to the expectations that came with such an opportunity? Professor Stevens gave her a reassuring smile. You don't have to worry about that. You've already shown what you're capable of. You've proven that you have the skills. Now it's time to show the world what you can really do. Leela swallowed hard. The weight of his words settled in her chest, but there was no fear, only a growing sense of determination. She could do this. She could prove to everyone, especially to herself, that she wasn't just the quiet girl in the back of the class, hidden away from the world's view. I'll do it, she said, her voice steady. I'll take the test, Professor Stevens beamed. Good, I'll arrange everything. You'll have a week to prepare. I'll make sure you have all the resources you need. Mr. Thomas, who had been watching silently until now, cleared his throat awkwardly. Well, I'll make sure everything is in order for you as well, Leela, he said, his voice oddly strained. I want to make sure you have all the support you need. There was a sincerity in his voice that surprised Leela. Whether it was genuine or just a reaction to being proven wrong, she wasn't sure, but she nodded anyway. Thank you, Mr. Thomas, Leela said quietly, her mind still processing everything that had just happened. As Professor Stevens and Mr. Thomas began to discuss the details of the upcoming test, Leela stood up slowly, her hands shaking just a little as she gathered her things. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on her. Her life, it seemed, was about to change in a way she had never imagined. She walked out of the classroom with the card still tucked into her pocket, a small smile tugging at her lips. This wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. And as she made her way through the hallways of Westbrook High, Leela Johnson finally allowed herself to imagine the future that had always seemed so far out of reach. The week leading up to the placement test felt like the longest of Leela's life. The moment she had agreed to take the test, everything had shifted. It wasn't just the excitement of a new opportunity. It wasn't just the fear of not measuring up to the expectations being placed on her. It was everything. The rush of anticipation, the weight of the future pressing down on her shoulders, the constant thought in the back of her mind that this was her chance to prove she was more than what people thought. Leela had always been the quiet one, the one who blended into the background, who never raised her hand in class unless she absolutely had to. It had always been easier that way, easier to avoid attention, easier to stay hidden. But now she was being thrust into the spotlight. She had to be more than just the girl sitting quietly in the back of the class. She had to be someone who could prove that her abilities were worthy of being recognized, that she had something valuable to offer. The first few days after Professor Stevens had handed her the scholarship opportunity card felt like a whirlwind. She had spent hours each night at her desk, working through advanced math problems, researching concepts she hadn't seen before, and trying to prepare herself for what lay ahead. There was no room for error now. This test, this moment, it was her shot. It was Thursday evening, the night before the test, and Leela was sitting at her desk in her bedroom, surrounded by textbooks, notebooks, and scattered scraps of paper. Her mother had brought her a cup of tea earlier, urging her to take a break to get some sleep, but Leela had barely touched it. Her mind was too occupied. Every time she solved one equation, another more difficult one would appear in her thoughts. Every time she closed a book, her brain felt like it was still running through the problems, running through every variable, every formula. Her mother had left her room almost an hour ago, but the weight of the moment still hung in the air. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, she would find out if she was good enough. She sighed and looked down at the notebook in front of her. The scribbled equations she had been working on all night blurred together, the lines of numbers and symbols starting to mix into one chaotic mess. Leela rubbed her eyes and picked up the pencil again. She could do this. She just had to focus. A knock at the door interrupted her concentration. Leela turned toward the sound, startled, and saw her mother standing in the doorway. "Sweetheart, you need to rest," her mother said, her voice gentle but firm. "You've been at this all day. One more night of studying isn't going to change anything." Leela looked at her mother and shook her head, feeling a pang of guilt for not listening to her. Her mother had always been supportive, even when Leela kept to herself and shied away from the spotlight. She had been patient with her, knowing that her daughter was capable of more than she let on. "I just want to make sure I'm ready," Leela murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mother smiled softly and walked into the room, sitting on the edge of the bed. "I know you do, honey," she said. "But you've already done so much. Trust yourself. You've already proven what you're capable of. Tomorrow, just do your best, and that's all anyone can ask for." Leela's eyes welled up slightly, but she quickly blinked the tears away. She didn't want to cry. Not now, not when she was so close. "I will," she promised, giving her mother a small smile. "Thanks, Mom." Her mother gave her a gentle kiss on the forehead before standing up. "Get some rest, all right," she said, leaving the room and closing the door softly behind her. Leela stared at the door for a long time after it closed, her mind racing. It was hard to believe that this was really happening, that tomorrow she would walk into the test knowing that her life could change in an instant. But for all the anxiety and uncertainty swirling in her chest, one thing was clear: she was ready. She had spent years hiding, but now she had the chance to show the world what she was capable of. Tomorrow was her moment. The next morning, Leela woke early, her heart thumping with anticipation. The sunlight filtered through the curtains of her room, casting a warm glow over everything, but it did little to calm her nerves. She could feel the weight of the day ahead pressing on her chest. She knew the test would be tough, but she had been studying, practicing every night. She had worked tirelessly, and now it was time to put all of that effort to the test. She dressed quickly, putting on her favorite shirt, simple, comfortable, but something about it made her feel grounded, like a piece of her own identity that no one could take away. She didn't look in the mirror. She didn't need to. What mattered wasn't what she looked like. It was what she could do. By the time she reached the university campus where the test was being held, Leela was already feeling the weight of the world on her shoulders. She had never been to a place like this before. So big, so professional, so overwhelming. There were students everywhere walking confidently, their heads held high. Some of them looked so sure of themselves, so self-assured. But Leela wasn't like them. She wasn't used to being the center of attention. Professor Stevens was waiting for her at the entrance, smiling warmly. "Leela, I'm glad you could make it. Are you ready for this?" Leela nodded, though her voice caught in her throat. "I think so." "Good," he said, motioning for her to follow him. "It's going to be challenging, but I have no doubt that you can handle it." The test was being held in a large lecture hall, and as Leela walked inside, she couldn't help but feel her stomach drop. The room was filled with other students, all of them focused and serious, all of them clearly as determined as she was to succeed. She found her seat at the back, away from the others, and tried to calm her breathing. A few minutes later, the test papers were handed out and the room fell silent. Leela unfolded the packet, her eyes scanning the instructions quickly. The first page was filled with a series of complex equations, algebraic expressions, calculus problems, geometric proofs, all demanding not just knowledge but the ability to apply that knowledge in creative and logical ways. Her heart raced as she began to work. The problems were challenging, yes, but she didn't hesitate. She broke them down one by one, solving each with the kind of focus that only came with years of practice. The numbers on the page blurred together, forming patterns, solutions, connections, her mind clicking through each problem with a rhythm she couldn't explain. The hours passed in a blur. Leela hardly noticed the time slipping away as she focused entirely on the test in front of her. She couldn't allow herself to think of anything else, not of the pressure to succeed, not of the implications of what this could mean for her future. She couldn't afford to make mistakes. She couldn't afford to let anything slip through the cracks. As she reached the final question, her hands were shaking slightly from the effort, but her mind was as sharp as ever. This was it, the last one. She took a deep breath and began working through it, her pencil moving rapidly across the paper. When she finished, she looked over her answers once more, ensuring everything was correct before carefully putting down her pencil. It was done. Leela sat back in her chair, her body tired but alert, her mind buzzing with the effort she had put forth. She had done it. She had given everything she had. The test was over. Now all that was left to do was wait. The days leading up to the final test had been a blur for Leela. Between the late-night study sessions, the pressure to perform, and the constant questions swirling in her mind, it was hard to tell where her focus truly lay. She had studied every equation, reviewed every concept, and practiced solving complex problems over and over again. But no matter how much preparation she did, there was still the unshakable feeling that it wasn't going to be enough. Tomorrow would be the day. Leela hadn't felt nervous like this before, not even when she had first been thrust into the spotlight by Mr. Thomas. That moment had been different. It had been an unexpected challenge. This was something far bigger. This test wasn't just about solving equations. It was about proving to the world that she was more than the quiet girl sitting at the back of the class. It was her chance to validate everything she had worked for, everything she had kept hidden from the world. As she sat at her desk, her textbooks open before her, her mind drifted back to that fateful moment when Professor Stevens had handed her the card. It felt like a lifetime ago now, but the memories were still so vivid. How could she have known back then what it would lead to? How could she have known that agreeing to take the test would open a door to a future she hadn't even dared to imagine? She shook her head and pushed the thoughts away. Tonight was about focusing, about clearing her mind of everything except the test ahead. Leela closed her books and glanced at the clock. It was already past midnight, and she had been working non-stop for hours. She yawned and stretched her arms above her head, but the thoughts in her mind wouldn't let her rest. She had done everything she could to prepare, but a lingering doubt still gnawed at her. What if she wasn't good enough? What if all of this was a mistake? Her mother had come into her room earlier to check on her, encouraging her to get some rest, but Leela had dismissed her concern. Resting meant letting go of the pressure, and she wasn't ready for that. She wasn't sure she ever would be. "Leela, you need to trust yourself," her mother had said softly. "You've done the work. Now you need to let it go and rest." Leela had nodded, but the words didn't reach her. Not yet. Not until tomorrow. The night before the test, Leela lay in bed, her mind racing. The sounds of the world outside her window seemed muffled, as if the universe itself had paused for this one moment in time. She had been working toward this day for as long as she could remember, and now that it was here, it felt as though everything had built to this point. Her thoughts circled endlessly, a whirlwind of anxiety, hope, and determination. When the alarm rang the next morning, Leela felt as though she had barely closed her eyes. She groggily got out of bed and made her way through her morning routine, her body moving on autopilot. The world felt distant, as though she were in a dream. There was no more time for second-guessing, no more room for doubt. She had to face this challenge head-on. By the time she arrived at the university for the final test, the atmosphere was electric. The campus was alive with students moving between buildings, the air thick with the sound of hushed conversations and the excitement of a new academic challenge. But Leela felt disconnected from it all. She wasn't like the other students, those who seemed so confident, so sure of themselves. They had been here before. They had walked these halls and sat in these classrooms. But this was new for Leela. This was her first step into the academic world that had always seemed so far out of reach. The test was to be held in a large auditorium-style lecture hall. As Leela entered, she was immediately struck by the immensity of the space. Hundreds of students were scattered throughout the room, all taking their seats and preparing for the test ahead. The walls seemed to close in on her, and the rows of students made the room feel even larger. Despite the pressure, Leela found a seat in the back, as far from the front as she could manage, and settled in. Professor Stevens walked into the room a few moments later, his calm demeanor reassuring despite the nervous energy in the air. He looked out over the crowd, giving a small smile as he spotted Leela in the back. She offered a tentative smile in return. He had been kind to her, encouraging her when she needed it and pushing her to believe in herself. His words had meant a lot to her, even though she hadn't always known how to accept them. "All right, everyone," Professor Stevens called, his voice echoing throughout the room. "This is it. The final test. You've been preparing for this moment for weeks, so I know you're ready. There will be no time limits, just focus and do your best. This test will be rigorous, but if you've been diligent, you'll know what to do. The questions will challenge you, but that's the point." Leela's heart began to race again. This was it, the moment she had been preparing for, the moment where everything would either come together or fall apart. She looked down at the desk in front of her, her hands shaking slightly. But she knew what she had to do. She had done everything she could. There was no more room for fear. The test papers were distributed, and Leela's eyes skimmed the first page. The problems before her were exactly what she had expected: challenging equations, complex word problems, geometric proofs that would push even the most advanced students to their limits. She felt a pang of nervousness, but it was quickly replaced by determination. This was what she had been waiting for. Leela moved steadily through the test, her mind clicking into gear as she worked through each problem. She tackled the algebraic expressions first, carefully simplifying and solving them with precision. Then came the calculus problems. Those were more difficult, but Leela had spent hours practicing them over the past few days, and now it was paying off. She didn't waste time on self-doubt. Instead, she worked with a quiet confidence, one problem after the next, breaking them down and solving them with methodical grace. The hours seemed to melt away as Leela continued to work, the pages of the test paper turning faster than she could keep track of. She didn't notice the clock on the wall or the other students around her. All that mattered was the test in front of her, and the quiet satisfaction she felt as each problem fell away, solved and erased. With every question she finished, she moved closer to her goal. But then, at the very end, there was one problem that made her pause. It was a tricky one, a combination of algebra, geometry, and trigonometry. Leela's eyes scanned it quickly, trying to piece together the solution. It was the most difficult problem on the paper by far, but it wasn't impossible. She could do this. She just had to focus. Her pencil scratched across the paper as she worked through the variables, simplifying them one step at a time. The minutes ticked by, but Leela was undeterred. Her mind was sharp, her focus absolute. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she finished the problem. She sat back in her chair, her hand aching slightly from all the writing, and looked down at the paper. It was done. She had finished. She had solved every problem. She had completed the test. Leela exhaled slowly, her chest heavy with the weight of what she had just accomplished. The test was over. Now, all that was left to do was wait. As the other students began to finish and the room grew quieter, Leela felt a sense of calm settle over her. She had done her best. She had worked tirelessly to prepare, and now she could only trust in the work she had done. The next few minutes were a blur. The test papers were collected, and students filed out of the room, still processing the challenge they had just faced. Leela remained seated for a few moments longer, her thoughts racing. She had done it. She had proven to herself that she could succeed, that she was more than just a quiet girl in the back of the class. And now, as she left the room and stepped back into the world, Leela knew one thing for certain: this was just the beginning.